So this is me and my brother. I'm the younger one. So we grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina in the 1980s, and we were actually the only two Sikh boys who wore turbans in the whole city of Charlotte at that time in the 80s. Like literally, I'm not exaggerating because there wasn't a huge South Asian community in Charlotte. So my parents knew every single Desi family, and there were very few Sikh families, and we were the only boys that wore turbans. So childhood was real isolating. I was certainly the only Sikh in my school, and bullying, harassment, very daily occurrences. That was just like what it meant to go to school. Kids on the playground asked me very commonly, "Are you black or are you white?" And that question always perplexed me. Charlotte was a very black and white city at the time, and my school was pretty mixed between black and white. Actually, my Mecklenburg County, where I went to school, was one of the first school districts in the country to do busing for school integration, and so I was a part of that because we lived in more suburban Charlotte in a wider area, and I was bused into a black neighborhood where I went to school, and kids would ask me, "Are you black or white?" And I didn't know how to answer it, but what was clear even from kindergarten was that I wanted to be white, right? Looking around at what I saw happening, at who had the resources, who were the popular kids. It's hard to say it out loud, but I definitely wanted to be white as a child. I definitely didn't want to be Sikh. I definitely wanted to cut my hair. Sikhs, we don't cut our hair, and we wear turbans, and I felt mostly resentment and shame around my racial identity, my religious identity, if you want to call it that. As a child, it's a very causal relationship between the bullying and torment that I was experiencing. Right, in the 5th grade, when I was 9 years old, a kid pulled off my turban on the playground, and at that age, I didn't know how to put on a turban myself. So my turban's basically hanging off my juda, my bun on the top of my head. I was wearing this kind of turban that you see in the picture, right? So it's like you can imagine it hanging off, and I had to be in school the rest of the day with my turban hanging off like that, just like feeling really embarrassed. And it wasn't even anger at that point, right? I didn't even have the self-confidence to be angry about it. I just felt like shame. That's the best word. So in many ways, my childhood was really defined by internalizing a lot of the racism I was experiencing. I didn't have the language of internalized racism at that time, but I had very little self-confidence. I was really shy. I was really insecure for a lot of my elementary and middle school years. And of course, decades later, I learned the language of internalized oppression. I was like, oh, I know that very well, right? Like when we'd be out at the mall or at a restaurant and my parents were speaking Punjabi, our native language, I would always respond in English. Sometimes I would kind of scold them and tell them to speak English, right? So I'd really this stuff was pretty deeply in me, and directly due to what I was experiencing every day. I don't know, I mean, this is, again, another tangent, but I don't know why I didn't cut my hair as a child. I came very close in the 5th grade, sort of shortly after that turban being pulled off incident that same year. But I didn't for some reason. I don't think there was any profound reason behind it, but ultimately that was a decision that shaped my life very deeply, the decision to keep my hair, because eventually it became the source of a whole lot of strength and a whole lot of Chardi Kala. So we are going to get there. And a big turning point in my life was at the age of 16. A teacher of mine suggested that I go to this summer camp called Anytown, and it was something organized by this now defunct organization called the National Conference for Community and Justice, and they ran these youth camps actually around the country. And for lack of a better word, they were basically social justice camps for young people, for high school students. Wasn't called that, didn't have that language at the time, but they brought together teenagers from many different walks of life. We were living in Arizona by this time, so this is up in the mountains of Arizona. And like truly diverse in the true sense. We had suburban white kids, we had Chicano kids, we had a lot of indigenous kids, we had black kids, we had kids that were caught up in gangs. We had kids that were caught up in the juvenile justice system. We had kids that were super privileged, right? It was like quite a range. And in this environment, it was a one-week thing where we had workshops around race, gender, class, sexuality. We'd have these daily discussion groups where we could have like real conversation with each other. And it was the first time in my life where I kind of told people what I had been experiencing my whole life, right? Where I talked about the racism that I had encountered and the bullying that I had dealt with, and in doing so felt so heard and so seen, and then very quickly started to see that I was the only Sikh at this camp, but started to see how related what I was experiencing was to what the queer kid was experiencing, to what the Chicano kid was experiencing in a predominantly white school, and so on and so forth. I really found my sort of personal sense of empowerment in that environment, right? Through this process of dialogue, through this process of telling my story and hearing other stories, and then being like, oh, it was like light bulbs, light bulbs, light bulbs. We have kind of a shared enemy of oppression and domination, which I probably would have called like hate at that time when I was 16, but eventually built more of a systemic analysis. And a few years later, just a few years later, I was in college and reading Paulo Freire. Can we get some hands for people who are familiar with Paulo Freire's work? All right, shout out to Paulo Freire, Brazilian educator, in many ways considered the father of popular education, right? Education for liberation, rooted in dialogue, and a core principle of Paulo Freire's is conscientização. Excuse my bad Portuguese. It's this idea of moving towards critical consciousness, and it's a painful process. It's a process that is birthed through dialogue, through sharing our stories. And as I was reading Paulo Freire, I was like, oh my God, this is exactly what happened to me at Anytown. And then after I went to Anytown, I became a counselor at Anytown, a facilitator at Anytown the next year, and that was something I would do every summer. So I started facilitating these kinds of conversations when I was about 17. And so, yeah, the process of conscientização is you know, his Pedagogy of the Oppressed is the book where this is kind of laid out, and it's this idea that when we get that critical awareness, which is a painful process of getting there, and he's speaking particularly from the perspective of the oppressed, but I think the methodology in many ways works for those who are privileged as well. Once we have that consciousness, there's no turning back, right? It's a new way that we see the world. It's a new way that we understand our experience. And once we have that understanding, once we have that consciousness, we have no choice but to act on it. Right, and so his sort of like theory, his approach is that if we can raise that critical consciousness among the oppressed, then revolution will happen, right? Then movements will be built, then change in society, then tyrants will be taken down, right? And so that in many ways has been how I orient my life. Basically, that turning point in my teenage years is what started moving me towards Chardi Kala, right? Because my consciousness was being raised. I was being heard and seen for the first time. I was finding my voice. I was finding my own sort of inner sense of empowerment, which led me right to Chardi Kala.